The FIA has just released new evidence about the 2026 engines. And it changes everything. Because this is not about lap times anymore. It is about a 60 km/h speed difference on the same straight. 360 km/h with full electric deployment. 300 if the battery dies. That is not racing. That is a closing speed no driver can react to. And now, after pre-season testing ended, the FIA confirmed they are monitoring torque spikes, restricting override usage, locking active aero at race starts, and preparing an emergency power reduction plan if Australia turns into chaos. But here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Max Verstappen is openly questioning whether this is still Formula One. He has called it artificial management instead of racing. And buried inside his contract is a clause that could allow him to walk away as early as next season if performance or enjoyment collapses. The engines are less powerful on combustion, more dependent on electric boost, more dependent on software, more dependent on regulation intervention. And the FIA insists there will be no major changes before the first race. So here is the real question. If 2026 becomes a season of lift and coast, battery management, and dangerous speed differentials, does the sport risk losing its biggest star? Subscribe now, because what the FIA just confirmed could decide not only the championship, but whether Verstappen stays in Formula One at all. Now let's slow this down. Because once pre-season testing ended, the emotion settled. And the numbers started to speak. Under the 2026 regulations, the combustion engine is no longer the dominant force. It produces roughly 550 horsepower. The electric system, however, can deploy up to 350 kilowatts. That is an enormous shift in philosophy. For the first time in modern Formula One history, the hybrid system is not just support. It is central. And that is where the instability begins. During testing in Bahrain, engineers simulated race scenarios where one car had full electrical deployment and the car ahead had already drained its battery. The closing speed reached nearly 60 km/h. Think about that. At over 300 km/h, the car ahead suddenly becomes dramatically slower. Not because of driver error. Not because of mechanical failure. But because energy ran out. That creates unpredictable braking points. Unpredictable lift and coast phases. Unpredictable defensive lines. And this is exactly what alarmed several drivers behind closed doors. George Russell reportedly described it as an aviation-level risk. A closing speed that feels like hitting a moving wall. And yet publicly, the FIA insists there will be no major regulation changes before Australia. They argue that early chaos is part of any new era. They say teams must adapt. They say software refinement will reduce the extremes. But at the same time, they introduced immediate technical directives. Active aero locked in high downforce during the opening laps. Manual override restricted to shorter activation windows. Aggressive monitoring of low gear torque spikes. Why introduce emergency controls if there is no concern? Because internally, the risk models are real. Now connect that to Verstappen. Max has never been subtle about his philosophy. He wants flat-out racing. He wants instinct over calculation. But 2026 forces drivers to think constantly. If I attack for 2 laps, I must save for 3. If I deploy here, I cannot deploy there. If I defend now, I may lose electrical support at the braking zone. That mental layer changes how drivers race. And for someone like Max, who thrives on natural rhythm and aggression, that is deeply frustrating. He has already hinted that enjoyment matters more than statistics, more than records, more than matching historical title counts. And here is the critical contractual reality. There is a performance clause active this season. If he is not within the top 2 of the championship by the summer break, he can legally open the exit door for 2027. That is not speculation. That is structure. Add to that the Helmut Marko clause. If Marko leaves the team, Max can trigger a release. These are not small details. They are pressure points. So when the FIA doubles down on the current direction, they are not just shaping the cars. They are shaping the future of the grid's most dominant driver. And the irony is striking. The governing body wants closer racing. More sustainability. More overtaking tools. But the drivers fear artificial speed swings. Software-dominated battles. Lift and coast phases that look more like endurance racing than Formula One. Testing has finished. The real-world trial begins in Australia. If we see dramatic Delta V incidents, if we see aggressive energy clipping mid-straight, if we see drivers lifting hundreds of meters before braking zones just to protect battery temperatures, the pressure will explode. And every time Verstappen repeats that he does not need to be here, the speculation will grow louder. Because this is no longer just about horsepower. It is about identity. What kind of sport does Formula One want to be in 2026? And more importantly, will its most ruthless competitor decide that this new version of racing is no longer worth fighting for? And this is where everything becomes uncomfortable. Because once the technical explanations are stripped away, what remains is a philosophical fracture. The FIA believes the sport must evolve. Smaller combustion engines, greater electrical contribution, active aerodynamics to reduce drag and improve efficiency, less dirty air, more sustainability. On paper, it sounds progressive, but inside the cockpit, the experience is different. Drivers reported that in slow corners, the cars feel explosive. The instant electric torque makes traction brutal, exciting, almost violent. But in high-speed corners, with reduced downforce and restricted floor performance, the cars feel lighter, more nervous. Some described it as driving two different machines in the same lap. That inconsistency demands constant mental recalibration. And mental fatigue is not something that shows on a timing screen. It accumulates. Lap after lap. Race after race. Now imagine adding the Delta V issue on top of that. You are already calculating battery levels. Already managing brake regeneration. Already monitoring temperature thresholds. And now you must anticipate whether the car ahead will suddenly lose 60 km per hour before the braking zone. That is not instinctive racing. That is predictive risk management. The FIA introduced geofencing for active aero, automatic closures of the rear wing before key braking zones, fail-safe systems to force maximum downforce if hydraulics fail, restrictions on override deployment windows. All of these measures reduce risk, but they also reduce driver agency. The car decides when it is safe, not the driver. And for some competitors, that shift is acceptable. For Verstappen, it feels like something is being taken away. He has openly called it artificial. He has said he does not want to calculate spreadsheets at 300 km per hour. And this is not frustration from losing. This is frustration from philosophy. He has nothing left to prove statistically. Multiple championships, financial security, global recognition. If enjoyment disappears, so does the incentive. That is what makes these rumors different from past contract dramas. This is not about money. It is about identity. Now consider the timeline. He is contractually committed this season. The performance clause becomes active mid-year. If Red Bull struggle with the Ford power unit, if energy management becomes intrusive, if safety concerns escalate in the opening races, the exit narrative strengthens. And the FIA knows this. They know that losing a driver of his stature during a regulation reset would be seismic. Commercially, symbolically, competitively. That is why their messaging is careful. No panic, but a plan B. Behind closed doors, there is talk of limiting electrical boost during races if Australia exposes extreme lift and coast behavior. Reducing deployment peaks to smooth Delta V differences. Balancing sustainability with racing authenticity. But those changes cannot come before real race data. Which means the opening rounds are a live experiment. And live experiments at 360 km per hour are not theoretical. They are visceral. So the first race becomes more than a championship opener. It becomes a referendum. If the cars race cleanly, if delta speeds remain manageable, if active aero systems function flawlessly, the storm calms. But if we see one dramatic incident caused by energy imbalance, if we see drivers forced into excessive lift and coast just to survive the straight, the conversation explodes. And the phrase, "I do not need to be here," gains weight. Because in the end, this is not only about engines losing combustion power. It is about whether Formula One can introduce a sustainable future without sacrificing the raw, instinctive essence that built its heroes. The FIA believes the pain of today creates the spectacle of tomorrow. But the real question is whether its most dominant champion is willing to endure that pain long enough to see tomorrow arrive. And here is the final layer that makes this even bigger than one driver. Because if Verstappen is questioning the direction of the sport, he is not alone in feeling the tension. Several drivers privately marked the Delta V issue as high risk during internal feedback sessions. More than half of the grid reportedly classified straight-line speed differentials as critical. That is not minor discomfort. That is structural concern. The governing body responded with technical safeguards. Fail-safe rear wings. Automatic high downforce activation before braking zones. Restrictions on low drag mode during starts and safety car restarts. Sensors monitoring torque spikes in lower gears. But none of those measures eliminate the root tension. The cars are now software dependent in ways Formula One has never experienced before. Energy flow. Brake regeneration blending. Override eligibility windows. Geofenced aerodynamic zones. The margin between brilliance and vulnerability is coded into algorithms. And that changes the driver's role. In previous eras, if something felt wrong, the instinct was mechanical. Adjust brake bias. Adjust throttle application. Trust the feedback through the steering wheel. Now, if something feels wrong, it might be software limiting deployment. It might be battery thermal protection cutting boost early. It might be a geofence forcing aerodynamic change. The driver becomes part racer, part systems manager. For some, that evolution is fascinating. For others, it dilutes the purity of competition. And this is where Verstappen's mindset becomes central to the narrative. He is not driven by legacy statistics. He is driven by sensation. The feeling of control. The immediacy of response. If that sensation is replaced by calculation and energy spreadsheets, motivation shifts. He has openly said that he can walk away and be content. That is rare in elite sport. Most champions chase numbers until the end. Max has hinted he would rather leave early than adapt to something he does not enjoy. Now combine that with the competitive uncertainty of a brand new engine era. Red Bull's Ford project is unproven under full race stress. If early reliability or deployment inefficiencies drop them outside the top 2 by mid-season, the contractual trigger becomes real. One decision before the end of August. That is all it would take. And if that happens, the entire grid reshuffles. Mercedes would be interested. Ferrari would be interested. Aston Martin, with Adrian Newey in a hypercar project, would be interested. Or perhaps he does not choose Formula 1 at all. Le Mans. Endurance racing. A different rhythm. Fewer races. Less marketing pressure. Still elite competition. The irony is striking. The 2026 regulations were designed to future-proof the sport. To attract new manufacturers. To align with road relevance. To modernize the identity of Formula 1. But modernization always carries risk. Too much artificial balance, and you lose instinct. Too much energy management, and you lose spontaneity. Too much software intervention, and you reduce driver autonomy. The FIA believes the early discomfort will fade as teams refine systems. They argue that 2014 felt chaotic too, and yet it stabilized. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps Australia will pass without incident. Perhaps the delta speeds will prove manageable in real racing conditions. But if even one dramatic example emerges, one car dramatically slower at the end of a straight, one active aero malfunction under pressure, one braking failure due to regeneration loss, the spotlight will intensify immediately. And in that spotlight, Verstappen's words will echo louder. Because the real issue is not whether the engines lost combustion power. It is whether the sport lost simplicity. And when simplicity disappears, so does the raw appeal that built legends. Pre-season is finished. The rulebook is set. The FIA has chosen stability over revision. Now the championship begins under that tension. And the question hanging over the entire grid is not just who will win in 2026. It is whether the sport's most dominant driver still sees himself in its future once this new era truly begins.